Now I'm going to talk today about making cuttings. It may seem a simple subject, but it still confuses people a lot, and not everyone is very successful with cuttings. Let me show you a few cuttings, but before I do that, what prompted me to do it was because this morning I did a I didn't do any YouTube. I did a one-to-one workshop with a customer working on a huge hinoki cypress, Chamaecyparis obtusa. These were the branches that I cut off that tree. It was a big tree, and by the way, I really kicked myself for not showing the video because it turned out to be such an interesting tree with a lot of intricate and complicated decisions. But the outcome was all this was being thrown away in the rubbish heap. So I rescued it, and I'm going to show you what I do with this because this is ideal cutting material. Also, I went to Wisley yesterday, and when I went to Wisley, I did some trimming, and I did some trimming of a mulberry tree that I have at Wisley. So rather than throw it away, I brought these back, so I'm going to make cuttings with mulberry. And this is a tree that has beautiful red fruit, so I want to propagate this variety. So what are cuttings? Cuttings are stem material, vegetative propagation. As many of you know, you can grow bonsai from seeds and cuttings and nursery plants. Growing from seed is possible because we produce all our maples from seed, quite a few other things we produce from seed, but cuttings are slightly faster than growing from seed. To show you how easy certain subjects are to make cuttings, let me show you these plants. This is a Ficus carica, edible fig. These cuttings were made last year, exactly a year ago, and I've already got a plant that big. It was made from these bonsai that we have, and I was about to prune this tree, but I said to myself, rather than just prune it, I'm going to show you viewers what I do with it. So this tree has gone a bit out of shape, so I need to prune it. So I usually prune it back to about here. I think all the others are okay. Now even these little shoots I'm going to prune back to there. All these little shoots, even that can make a cutting. So they're not being wasted, but they're going to be used for making cuttings. Okay, so even that one. You can see how interesting these plants are. You see, these are the miniature fruit. The fruit will be born on that. So that is all going to be used for cutting material. This is hinoki cypress. Now, I will show you some examples of cuttings that I did a couple of years ago. As I said to you, some cuttings are easy to make, others are not. This is juniper itoigawa. This cutting was made last year, and it's already formed a lot of root. Junipers are slow to grow. Look at the root on that. So in 1 year, it's formed all that root. So my cutting, so I've potted them up. This is a 2-year-old cutting, and this also will have a lot of root in it. I can feel it. It's quite tight. Look at that. 2-year-old cutting. This is a 5-year-old cutting. Again, Chinese juniper cutting. And I potted it on into a bigger tree. This is a ficus. All the ficus family are very easy to propagate. This one I think was made maybe a couple of years ago, and we use quite a thick stem. So already we have a tree which has a thick stem, and it can almost be ready to shape into a bonsai. While I'm talking about cuttings, let me show you some more. Certain species are easier to strike than others. Forsythia, as you know, is very easy to propagate. So these are Forsythia cuttings that I put into this flower pot back in early April. I was pruning my Forsythia after they flowered. Many of you will remember I have a huge Forsythia with a trunk which is about 18 inches in diameter. And the cuttings which I prune off, I just stuck in, and I did an experiment. I used a bit of Akadama soil here to make the cuttings. And look at how prolific they are. They've all rooted, 100% success. That means every cutting I stuck in the soil made root. So this is the result of it. Look at that. That's one stem. That's another stem. Every plant, even that one, they've all made roots. So I'm going to pot them into individual pots because that's the next stage. After they root, you put them into separate pots. There you are. All of them have struck roots. So this is Forsythia. So I said to you, some are easier than others. So this was using Kanuma and a mixture of Kanuma and Akadama soil, just as an experiment. Now this one, in case you don't know the varieties, viewers who live in the tropics and especially those who live in India will recognize this tree. This is a peepal tree or Bodhi tree with the long tail. And this is supposedly the tree under which Buddha sat when he gained enlightenment. And this particular cutting was made from a tree that was made from a cutting about 30 years ago. The original tree I do not own, but the original tree was kept at our nursery maybe about 5-10 years ago. And the owner kept it here because he wanted me to revive it and take care of it. And I pruned the ends off like I pruned the figs, and I made a cutting from it. So this is a very famous tree. This poor gentleman has passed away, but he was a very dear friend of mine. And he got the cutting when he visited India in Bodh Gaya. He's a practicing Buddhist. And by the way, this gentleman is such an interesting man. He is a Jewish immigrant to Canada, lived in UK most of his life. And not only that, although he is of Jewish ethnicity, he is a practicing Buddhist. So he gave me this plant and I made cuttings from it. So I will always treasure this plant. Being a tropical plant, it doesn't stand the cold, so I have to protect it in our greenhouses. But it doesn't grow so well in the UK because it is really a native of the tropics. So much for the introduction. Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty and show you how cuttings are made. Okay. What do we do about preparation? There are many ways you can put these cuttings. You can either grow them in ordinary seed trays, but I've got for you here a variety of seed trays. This is a standard seed tray that you can buy. It's only about 1.5 or 1.25 deep, typical seed tray. This is almost similar but black in color. But I prefer not to use these seed trays for a very simple reason. I do not like to make cuttings in shallow seed trays. You need to make the seed trays in trays which are as deep as possible. And I use either these green seed trays, which are much deeper, you can see the difference in the depth, much deeper, or better still, these are our commercial carrying trays. I also use them as seed trays. They have a lot of drainage. You see that beautiful drainage. You don't want them waterlogged, so this has good drainage. And I prefer to use this because it is deep. The reason why I like deep seed trays is because the deeper the tray, the more heat it generates and the less quickly will the soil dry out. Does it make sense? If you have a shallow tray, it dries very quickly. Deep tray, it doesn't dry out. And I will show you when we insert the cutting, we insert it as deep as possible. Other things you can use are flower pots like this. You saw the Forsythia, we use the flower pot to root them in. So flower pots can also be used, but use them as deep containers rather than shallow containers. So what do we fill as a rooting medium? After all, it's only rooting medium, and I prefer to use just ordinary compost. In the days when we used peat, now peat is a dirty word in horticulture these days. Nobody uses peat anymore. But there is compost that you can use. This is ordinary garden compost that you can buy. And I think it's a mixture of bark and composted leaf material. So anything free draining. You can add sand to it as well, because sand is very good, but there's no need to add sand. I prefer to use just the peat on its own. I'm not going to advertise the brand because you can use any type of compost. So fill the tray full to the top, as deep as possible. I know that for most of the amateurs, they probably will not be able to put too many trays around the house or in the garden. I have a greenhouse, so I don't mind, I can put them there. But because we propagate so many cuttings, we do them in these large trays. I will fill it to the top, as I said, because I want the full depth. Okay, it's filled to the brim, the top. I'm not compressing at all because I like to keep it fairly loose. Unfortunately, a lot of these proprietary compost these days have got sticks in it. Try to get the sticks out. If you can add sharp builder sand, that also helps. Someone also asked me, can you use sphagnum moss? Yes, if you can afford to buy sphagnum moss can also be used. So this is sphagnum moss. You can make cuttings in sphagnum moss, but I prefer to keep it for my air layers. So that is how you prepare the seed tray. Now when it comes to making the cutting itself, always cut below the node. That is called the node. Below the node, that's where the roots will come from. And I try to remove as many leaves as possible. Now supposing I was going to make a cutting with this, I will remove the bottom leaves, remove this one, and possibly only half of this. The reason why I remove the leaves is because if you leave the leaves on, the leaves act as like an umbrella, a piece of cloth which will lose moisture. So you don't want it to lose moisture because that will dry the cutting out. So the less surface area you have, the better. But you need to keep some leaves because that generates the root action and stimulates growth. So this one, for instance, the leaf is too big. I will cut it in half, but I leave some of the leaves. That's another cutting below the node. So I remove that and remove that. That is sufficient. So I've got here 3 fig cuttings, and you can always help it by putting hormone rooting powder. I don't know if you can get this. This is a commercial hormone rooting powder. And if I read out what the thing contains, it says a ready for use rooting powder containing 0.25% of indolyl butyric acid, IBA. That's the active ingredient of all the hormone rooting powders. You don't have to use hormone rooting powder, but it certainly helps and speeds up the process. So you dip the ends in hormone rooting powder and insert it as deep as possible. So if you insert it as slant, you get maximum contact. Don't just insert it at the top like that. The deeper you insert it, the better it is because it keeps it warm and it has more surface area to contact with the soil. So just keep the top poking out like that. Now these are the hinoki cypress that I've got. Now how do I make cuttings from that? I have explained before with maples and other deciduous plants how you do nodal cutting and heel cutting. But with evergreens, junipers and hinoki cypress, for instance, I prefer to use what are known as heel cuttings. Let me explain to you what a heel cutting looks like. Now that's a fork in the branch, and if I tear this apart, you see how thick the cutting is? That is as thick as a matchstick. That's the best way to describe it. As thick as a matchstick. That is ideal. Don't be tempted to try and make a cutting with something as thick as that. That's thicker than a pencil. You can't be too greedy. If you use a thick cutting, it will not work. It's too old, the wood. If you tear it from there, that's a heel cutting. That would work because that is like a toothpick or a matchstick thick. So that is called a heel. That's why it's called a heel. You clean up the heel, clean the lower foliage, cut the top so that it doesn't transpire so much. That is ideal cutting. Now I was showing you earlier, I pulled out a piece there. Now that one is forked over there, so if I pull it apart, that makes a heel cutting. You see, that's what we call the heel. But you got to clean the heel by cutting it back there, and that one you cut back there, and you clean the bottom of the stem because that's going to be inserted in the soil. Clean the bottom of the stem and take the growing tip out. So you don't want to lose too much moisture, but you still stimulate the growth. So that's another heel cutting there. Clean that. Now we got to stick this in the soil. No, not in soil, in hormone rooting powder. And then insert that at a slant, not straight, at a slant, like so, about an inch apart. And that will be a perfect heel cutting. How long does it take to root? If you do it well, certain species are quicker than others. Ficus, for instance, will root in maybe 3 weeks. Hinoki cypress may root in 2 to 3 months. So different species behave differently. Different species also behave differently in the sense that some are more difficult to root than others. I find that juniper roots quite easily. Different types of juniper root easily. Pines will never root. See, now this is as big as a cutter you want, no bigger than that. That's getting on the big side. In fact, if it was me, I would try and cut it there and make a root cutting, heel cutting from there. So the thinner the cutting, the better. But I may try this, it might work. I'll leave a little bit of foliage there and see if it works. At a slant, at a slant, at a slant, like that. So that is how I make the cuttings. Now what I do with the mulberries. Now let me show you with the mulberry. This is a broadleaf tree. Now I can make a heel cutting. If you can see what I'm going to do, come close. See at the junction there, I'm not tearing it, but I know that that would be a junction. So clean the bottom of the leaves. Now I can get 2 cuttings from this. I can stop the tree up to here and get a cutting that long. So the bottom part will make 1 cutting, but if I make a nodal cutting, this is what we call a node, a leaf node. Just cut below that. So this is a nodal cutting, this is a heel cutting. Again, stick it into the hormone rooting powder, and that is a cutting. You see that I've mixed it different species. I usually prefer to keep the same species together because they root at different rates, and that's how we do it. So I hope this repetition of making cuttings, because I've talked about it before, will encourage you to make your own cuttings, and you will find it is really exciting when they find the roots going into the soil, coming through the bottom of the pot, and you can see new growth and you get a new plant. So this is how we produce our cuttings. So don't throw away material like this, but try it. Certain species like pines are very difficult to airlayer, but this airlayers quite easily. So have a go and you will have a lot of fun.